I'd like to welcome everyone for today's class. Last week we were discussing about Socrates, and the recording can be found on the site of the classroom platform. Now, today, unavoidably, we would have to start talking about his most famous student and probably the best known philosophers of all time. One of the most productive philosophers as well in terms of writing, Plato. And we would have to admit also that we might not be able to comprise everything into one class. Well, it is virtually impossible. When you would find certain philosophical courses that deal all around the world that deal with Plato for years. And of course it's not futile, in the sense that someone once said that the history of at least of European and mostly North American thinking is in fact footnotes to Plato. So even if we would say, okay, that's probably a bit far-fetched, nonetheless, he's definitely one of the chiefly important thinkers of all time, whose major thoughts and analysis of various ideas have permeated Western culture, and in general they have been considered as being one of the most important influencers in the classical sense of the word, in terms of what we think of philosophy, morality, but even he has a massive influence on Christian theology as well, especially his system of thought. Well, let's start with a brief sketch of his life and times. He is the student of Socrates and the teacher of Aristotle. So this puts him into a very interesting position, since he has been an admirer of Socrates, and his student Aristotle admired him. Nonetheless, he was also his most fierce, although very elegant and very respectful critique. In what sense? Mainly regarding his notion of the ideas, which we will come to talk about fairly soon. Let's say a few words about his life. What we know is that he was born around about 428 or 427 before Christ. There's some wiggling, let's say until 431. Which year will be the exact date of his birth, but we will not bother about this. It really depends on how we interpret certain ancient sources. It's actually fairly good that we can actually set a date, a fairly reasonable, or a fairly most accepted date, or at least year to his birth. Having lived apparently until the age of 80 or 81, so had a long life, especially considering the ancient times. It was not necessarily, how should I put it, customary or usual for someone to lead a long life like that. So he died around about 348, 347 before Christ. Now, what should we know about his family? Actually, his birth is quite interesting in the sense that his parentage, although of course both on his mother's and his father's side, there's a claim that they trace back their lineage to the god Poseidon, which is of course fairly, I'm not saying commonplace, but pretty usual. If you are of royal blood, mind you. He was in fact, on his father's side, a late descendant of one of the last kings of Athens. Now remember, by the time Plato is born, and worse, of course, Athens is a democracy, and fiercely proud of it. We're talking about also in the last years of Socrates, or just before the death of Socrates, there was this Peloponnesian War between Sparta and Athens. So these political issues and the debates between the validity and acceptability of various political systems, like kingdom versus democracy, etc., come to the forefront. So, in that sense, Plato, being the son of Aristotle, his father, and of Perictione, his mother, is actually a very. It means that he was a very highly, well, mostly privileged member of Athenian society. As you probably know, if you were born of an Athenian man and woman who have been both citizens of Athens, then you had access to full Athenian citizenship. It was not an automatic thing. Just being born in Athens, within the walls of the city, did not grant you that privilege. For example, if your father was an Athenian citizen, but your mother was a slave, or vice versa, or either of your parents was an Athenian citizen, yet the other one was not an Athenian citizen, but coming in from somewhere else, you were most likely not granted Athenian citizenship. Why is that so important? Well, for example, it is important because of your access to all the information and all the benefits of being an Athenian citizen, including, for example, your schooling. So that if you were an Athenian philosopher, an Athenian citizen, you gained access to all of these great schools. Otherwise, you were excluded from it, as we shall see, for example, in the case of the so-called Cynic philosophers, or the Cynics, led by Antisthenes, and brought to their absolute peak by Diogenes of Sinope, and how they actually taught each other and were not given access. They were not given permission to follow or to study within the publicly accessible schools of Athens, which were only accessible to the citizens. So Plato didn't have any problem with that, having come from one of the wealthiest and politically also influential families in Athens. He was all right in that sense, albeit not all members of his family were, how shall I put it, were seen as being blameless in one way or another. For example, one of his uncles, called Charmides, was a member of the notorious 30 Tyrants, who in fact overthrew the Athenian democracy in 404, just 5 years before Socrates was put to death. And Charmides' own uncle, so Plato's uncle's uncle, Critias, was in fact the leader of this 30. This body of government, or this gremium, wasn't really recognized by, well, traditionally Athenian Democrats, so to speak. And of course, that is something he wanted himself to, well, gently distance himself from. Of course, not all his relatives were that sort of belonged to this oligarchic fashion. You know, oligarch is an important term here. Oligarch, it's composed of two words. Oligos means little or small. Arche means, it can mean inception, beginning, principle, but even power, hierarchy, hierarchos, for example. So oligarchy literally means, of course, a group of people who gain power. It can even mean a system of government, oligarchy, when the power is in the hands of the wealthy few. It's something that is not necessarily preferred, and it should be distinguished from a different form of government, which actually Socrates, but also Plato, and I think, and we can argue even Aristotle was quite in favor of, which was called aristocracy. In this sense, aristocracy should not be considered as being a layer of the society, a group of people, but rather a form of government. Here, Aristos means someone who is able, someone who is fit to do something, the best, the best, or the sharpest knife, so to speak. And and kratos means power. So aristokratos, aristokratia, aristocracy, meant, of course, that the power is in the hands of those who are really fit for the job. It's not. The oligarchy is in fact a deterioration of that, because aristokratia, as I said, all these philosophers speak of it in positive terms. It means that those people are ruling the country who are really fit to rule. Whereas when the oligarchs or oligarchy comes to power, that means, of course, that the wealthy few take over, and that's a totally different thing. Without exemplifying anything, you would say, let's say, the 1970s and the 80s Argentina. That's a typical oligarchy for you, in that sense. Coming back to Plato then, so he comes from a family with ties to the tyrants, but also in positive, also who can be seen in positive light. For example, his stepfather, Pyrilampes, was said to have been a very close associate with Pericles when he was the leader of the democratic faction. So in that sense, that puts him in a better position. Now, his actual given name was Aristocles, as far as the historical evidence goes, probably after his grandfather. Plato seems to have been started as a nickname. Platos in Greek means broad. It either, there are certain theories of how it came about. Probably his wrestling teacher was the one who gave him this nickname, for he had such a broad shoulders, so that his physique was in that sense that, or for the breadth of his style, because he had long dialogues written, and perhaps even the breadth of his forehead. We just don't know. Nonetheless, even if one of the epitaphs on his tomb was mentioning the name Aristocles, everybody, the whole world, came to know him as Plato. Now, we need to figure out what happens to him once Socrates dies. So the first thing I'll do is I'll have here a little map to show you of his, we'll talk about the travels he made. So, as we know that he is in fact a philosopher born and raised in Athens. Now, of course, when Socrates died, being sentenced to death and submitting to the sentence and drinking that, hemlock, which actually caused him to die slowly. Yet all his followers and all these young people who surrounded and who were really adepts and really sort of, how should I put it, his disciples in a way, his students of Socrates, felt somehow to be in danger. Of course, it's not, how should I put this, not unusual. I mean, Socrates himself was charged, although not officially, but he was suspected of treason. Some people claim, some of his critiques, that he was in fact very much advocating, or let's say sympathizing with the Spartan cause. Remember that Sparta won the Peloponnesian War, and Athens was for some time, taken over by this rule of the 30, and that although Socrates saved the life of Alcibiades in one battle, so he fought for Athens, yet Alcibiades himself was exiled for being sympathetic to the Spartan cause. So there is a lot of political machinations behind his trial. So if you were his student, you obviously fell under some sort of suspicion as to what your political views are. Moreover, we have to say that based on Plato's dialogues, we see Socrates as well not being, how shall I put this, not being an absolute fan of the widest democracy. He's also rather the adept of either a restricted democracy or aristocracy, the way I just described before, which obviously makes perfect sense when we think about how easily the will of the crowd, the will of the multitude can be swayed. So it's a simple majority decision is not necessarily always the best one, but I don't want to enter political philosophy. What I'm trying to tell you is how Plato ends up feeling at least to be in danger. So once Socrates is executed, he flees from Athens to Megara. It's about 40 some kilometers from Athens, so it's not that far. And today it probably is just the agglomeration part of the metropolitan area of Athens, probably today. And he stays there with one of the former students of Socrates by the name of Euclides. You shouldn't confuse this Euclides to the other one, to the very, very famous Euclides of Alexandria, whose principles in mathematics are still at the very base of modern geometry, until some of his postulates were challenged. Some of his famous postulates were challenged by the Hungarian scientist and mathematician Jan Boyer, who built the non-Euclidean geometry, out of which stems Einstein's theory of relativity, but even space travel and satellite phones, etc. All that. So the two Euclides are not the same. All right. Once he spends a bit of time in Megara, allegedly he actually travels to Egypt. Now, of course, there's not much evidence of what, how, where, how he traveled there, how much time did he spend there, what kind of influences were, what kind of influences did he encounter. What we know, of course, is that Egypt is the academy or the university of the ancient world. So basically, all the knowledge that has been accumulated for millennia was somehow preserved, especially by the priests of Athens. So it was not a bad place to go to if you wanted to study something. Remember, most philosophers, including Pythagoras and others, would at some point in their lives travel to Egypt, as well as Democritus, as we have said it before from up there. The other important event, however, which is of course far better documented, for example, in his 7th letter, he has 13 surviving letters, and his 7th letter can be considered as being, well, how should I put it, his scientific or scholarly autobiography, something like that. Well, definitely ends up in the southern Italy. He might have come in contact with Pythagoreanism at this point. We don't know whether he went to Croton or not, where Pythagoras' school was earlier. We definitely know from his work that he had a lot to thank Pythagoras and the Pythagorean thinking. What we know from his letter, however, is, and of later philosophers, is that he travels to Sicily later on, especially visiting the city of Syracuse, Syrakusai. Why is that so important? Because the city of Syracuse was a small state, like Athens, but unlike Athens and even unlike Sparta, Syracuse was the system of government in Syracuse was what the ancient Greeks would call tyrannis, which means, we could translate it literally as tyranny, which meant, of course, the rule of one person. Yet it's not a constitutional monarchy, as you would, let's say, talk about England or Great Britain, and to some extent, of course, Spain as well. You would have a king that sort of, but it's a symbolic. It's rather a symbolic thing that doesn't really involve anything, political decisions or whatever. Yeah, it is nice actually to call the Cup of Spain Copa del Rey. Is something it's actually better than receiving from the Prime Minister. Thank you. But sorry, I really envy that. So Syracuse was something of a peculiar kind of government, having at its helm a chap called Dionysius the First. He's the one who invites Plato here. There was also Dion, his political associate, who was also very keen to have Plato there. As it appears to me, Dionysius was really attracted to Plato's thoughts and probably liked to experiment. As like rich people with power and money do. There's this interesting chap. We don't buy a Bugatti, whatever, or a Ferrari, whatever. We just invite this, celebrity Plato. Okay, let's just have him play around. Well, Plato, however, made the mistake of actually taking Dionysius' invitation seriously, that he really wanted to have an experiment of actually putting in practice what Plato thought how a society should work, how a new republic, how any form of government, any good form of government should be built up. And he gave him some freedom. So he started organizing the society in the way he thought would be best. But, as it turned out, neither the tyrant nor the people, the courtiers, were actually happy with him. And apparently, at a certain moment, Dionysius the First did not just imprison Plato, but if we can believe some of the other sources, he actually have arranged for Plato to be sold into slavery. So it's a kind of bizarre thing. He barely escaped this predicament and went back to Athens. Now in Athens, he buys a nice place around about 1 kilometer, 1.5 kilometers outside the city walls of Athens. It was a place dedicated to a so-called Heros, Akademos, or Hekademos was the name of that hero. There he founded his school, so that's why it's called Academia, because it was the place dedicated to Akademos, Heros. Now, whilst at the helm of the school, of course, Aristotle was his most famous student in the academy. He gets invited yet again to Syracuse, because now the son of the former tyrant, Dionysius II, also wants to have a go of what this famous philosopher might help us around that. He invites him there. Well, he's reluctant to go, but then he goes. That thing ends up badly as well, because Dion is sent into exile for sedition. Plato is effectively imprisoned. Well, he he's called being the guest of the tyrant, of the tyrannos. Yeah, well, you are a guest, and when you are a guest and you're not allowed to leave, well, that's sort of a gilded cage kind of thing. Eventually, he escapes. He actually gains his permission to return to Athens. Says, okay, thank you very much, I won't travel back again. Yet, a few years later, he sent word to return for the third time to Syracuse, and to do, or to realize what, now this time it will work. Plato's very reluctant, doesn't want to go. But after that, a year later, the tyrant of Syracuse doesn't really give up. He doesn't only send a letter, this time he sends a ship to bring Plato to Syracuse. So, as Don Vito Corleone would say, it was an offer he couldn't refuse. So he had to go back again to Syracuse. He does his best, yet he's again being imprisoned, whatever, and finally escapes somehow and just swears never to return. Now, what we can gather from this is, of course, that these three unsuccessful trips were and could be considered, of course, as being total failures and disasters, yet all three actually produced three major and famous works by Plato. After the first unsuccessful attempt in traveling to Syracuse, he wrote the Republic. After the second travel, he wrote the Statesman, and after the third one, he wrote his famous book, Laws. So in that sense, the three major works which deal with his political thought, his social philosophy, and his ethics, or political ethics, whatever you call it, are actually the fruit of these three futile or failed attempts to create an ideal society. We'll return to that, to his idea of an ideal society and how ideal it was and how it can actually be seen with modern eyes. But we should not get ahead of ourselves. What we know still of him, and it is very important here, is that Plato did not, by any chance, think that his ideas for the ideal society would be popular. He said, or he thought, they were reasonable. I think where he fails, and I don't want to sound rude, of course I respect him immensely, is that he started probably with the false assumptions most philosophers do concerning the human being, and that is, they consider the human being as being a rational one. Well, we are not. We are emotional beings. I think probably I have already spoken a few words about this earlier on. Every now and then we may be forced to act rationally based on reason, but most of our decisions, and we have hundreds, if not thousands of decisions every day, like for example, did I decide to take 3 steps here and then 3 steps back? No, but it's a decision because I'm doing it. So all of that, most of it is emotional as well as sometimes even gut feelings, that the way most of our decisions are driven by. So actually very little decisions that we take are rational. And of course, it's not even human to be rational all the time. Of course, so sometimes it would be nice to be both rational and human. And it's very, very dangerous that, or very, very sad that sometimes reason actually becomes inhuman for a number of reasons. So basically, Plato's experiments didn't really bring him the satisfaction on a practical level. Yet, the works he produced after these trips were definitely read through and commented on and what have you throughout the centuries and millennia that followed. Okay, as we said, his famous student was Aristotle, who remained part of the academy until the death of his master, albeit he already criticized him already during his life. That's what's reflected in Plato's works as well, in later works. So that he was already influenced, and it's very interesting, very laudable that he was somewhat taken by his pupils' criticisms and trying to step back from some of his earlier positions. Which of course brings us to the question, of course he died at the age of 81 or 84 and was buried around, apparently somewhere on or around the academy's grounds, although no archaeological effort was ever successful so far to find his grave, actually. Now, whilst we are at this, we will need to talk about also his three, how shall I put it, sequences, or his three periods of writing. We know that some of the early, first let's talk about the influences on him, and then the three major how shall I put it, periods of his life as a philosopher and a writer. Who are the ones who really influenced him? First and foremost is probably Heraclitus. Plato definitely had some early association with either the philosophy of Heraclitus or with one or more of that philosopher's followers. The effects of this influence can perhaps be seen also in the older or mature Plato's conception of the sensible world as ceaselessly changing. You remember that from our presentations that there were these two virtually and diametrically opposing views of the world, represented first by Heraclitus of Ephesus on the one hand, and by Parmenides and Xenophalia, and Melissus for that matter, on the other. What was that consisting of? As we said, Heraclitus of Ephesus claimed that all are one, everything flows, pantarei, and all are changing. Even more, he says, changing is constant to the very if you go to the very kernel of things, it says, we cannot step into the same river twice. You are stepping the same river and you are not stepping the same river. What does he want to say? Because it says, the river exists only because the water in itself is always changing. So that some elements will have to change always in order for that which they produce to be constant. Because if the waters were not changing, were not flowing in the river would cease to exist. It would be a lake if there's one, or something like that. That means, of course, the constant change is somehow defining what is existent, as it were. Remember also that he spoke of these contradictions or opposites, like you do not cherish your health before you actually experience illness. You do not cherish your good, wealth or just well-being unless you experience poverty, etc. And then he says that all these things and the opposites are linked to each other, so there is a constant change in this world and nothing abides. Now, if we were to think that on the other hand, or the other end of the scale, the other part of the world in Sicily, not Sicily, in Area, so that's the boot, the lower boot of the Italian peninsula. The Eleatics say totally the opposite. What exists must not be subject to time, to change at all, because if something changes, that means it has a beginning and it has an end, so it's a non-existent. So therefore, what really exists must be one, must be eternal, timeless, unchangeable, totally different. You would think, how on earth can you reconcile those two things? And that's what Plato does, in fact, with his theory of the forms, which actually brings into the concept of two worlds. He borrows the world of ours, we'll talk about it very soon, from Heraclitus, meaning that the changing world that we experience is the world we live in, and it is in fact a world of shadows. It is in fact an illusion. And then he takes the other world, the other concept of the Eleatics, modifies it a bit, of course, because the Eleatics were clinging to the fact that the really existent, that which really exists must be one. Well, he multiplies that because he talks about the eternal forms, the eternal ideas, eidos, idea means form in Greek, form, something that you can see with your mind's eye, etc. And then he says, well, those are the really existent, constant, and non-changing, eternal beings, whereas our world is just a world of shadows. So it actually puts the two worlds on top of each other and actually tries to reconcile these with a very, very, we could say, original thought, which most likely is rooted in Socrates' notions. So these are the two influences, Heraclitus, Parmenides, and Zeno. Then the Pythagoreans. The Pythagoreans are in fact quite interesting. That's why some claim that he, before Syracuse, sometime during that time, must have visited the southern part of Italy as well, or at least definitely he must have been acquainted with the thoughts of the Pythagoreans. Well, he was a friend of Archytas of Tarentum, a well-known Pythagorean statesman and thinker. Now, in his fascination with mathematics and some of his political ideals, expressed in various ways in several dialogues, he is related to Pythagoreanism. I would say not only, because Pythagoras is again known for having talked about the immortality of the soul, the reincarnation of some sort. And of course, you could see the influence of Pythagoras, I would assume, for example, in the discussion or in the dialogue entitled Phaedrus. We will talk about that later, probably during next class. What other influence? Of course, Socrates. He's the one who had the greatest influence on Plato, a greatest influence in the sense that he has written some plays and tragedies and poems before having met Socrates. And once he met Socrates, he burnt all that. So that old chap must have been a real exercise, a real influence on this young man. So that he deemed everything that he had written before meeting Socrates as useless, so to speak. Now, of course, what is in fact, the major influence can be seen is that Socrates is the teacher in virtually all of his dialogues, save for Laws. It isn't done. In all his other books, all his other dialogues, all his other works, Socrates is the teacher. So Plato does not say anything in first person. He puts all his thoughts, all his ideas into the mouth of Socrates. Now that shows a great deal of respect. A great deal of respect on his part towards his master. And of course, one of the most important notions, or one of the most important areas in which Socrates has influenced him is obviously ethics and his political thinking. That's by all means the case. Now, Plato's writings and and the dating of his dialogues are the most important things here. We'll jump all this, and of course there will be yes, you would this period or this division is a bit more detailed, so about 5 periods. Roughly, we can say that for an easier going through, we would ask for, or we would talk about 3 major periods in Plato's life. The early period of his writings are in fact those works which are mostly connected to Socrates. That is, all written after the death of Socrates, but before Plato's first trip to Sicily. These are the works that are actually mostly concerned with Socrates' dialogues with people, and probably these are the ones, or most of these are those who are a fairly reliable account of the events and the discussions that took place or could have taken place between Socrates and his followers. So to this one, to this group, this early group belongs, of course, the Apology of Socrates. That's one of the most important ones. Charmides, Kriton, Euthydemus, Eutyphro, Gorgias, Hippias, the 2 Hippias is Ion, Laches, Lucis, Protagoras, and perhaps the Republic, Book 1. Just 1. Still there, Cratylus, Menexenos, and Menon would be the one that still would belong to this early group, I would say. The second period of his life, that involves already the travel to Egypt and the travels to Syracuse with all the adventures, so to speak. Produces works like Phaedon or Phaedo, the rest of the books of the Republic, as well as the famous Symposium. Still in that book, still in that middle group, I would say we could include Parmenides, Theaetetus, and Phaedrus. Phaedrus or Phaedrus, the famous one about the soul, the nature of the soul, the chariot, etc. We'll talk about that. And then later, his late works, that is, in fact, those works which are already speaking of the reality that the aging teacher has obviously reflected on his students, and I mean Aristotle's criticisms of his teaching concerning the ideas and the anamnesis, the thought of remembering, the notion of remembering. So he appears to have revised some of his views in his later works, and to this scholars would quote works like the Sophist, the Statesman, Philebus, Timaeus, Critias, and Laws, as being already testimonies of the aging Plato as having revised somewhat his earlier thoughts, represented especially in the books of his in the works of his early career and mid career. And it's actually quite laudable from a highly respected teacher like Plato at the time to actually consider his students' observations and actually try to modify some of his positions which he held in early works. All right. Now, in order to be able to encompass as much as possible, I will try to do the following. I will just bear with me one moment, because I did this experience and I had this experiment and it worked, so it should work. Just a second. Yep. So what we shall do is the following. We shall have an extension of the 2 sites, of the two well, okay, where does that appear? Okay, did that appear? Yes. So you have the two. What we shall do is you will see the image here of what the story is about, and you will hear me reading the part of the book in the Republic which actually describes this picture, and that's how we shall try to put it together. So in order to see this world of ideas, before we start this world of Plato, that he actually created, this double world, below is Heraclitus' world, on top is the world of the Eleatics, modified, of course. What's the whole point of it? He tries to show you that, and us, of course, human perception and the perception of the senses is virtually unreliable. You can put 2-3 bowls of water on the table, one with hot water, one with cold water, and in the middle you have lukewarm water, and you put your left and right hands into the hot and cold water, and then you keep it there for, let's say, a minute, and you put both of them into the middle bowl, and your two different arms, your two different hands, give you conflicting information about whether the water is warm or hot, depending on if it comes from hot water, it will feel cold. If it comes from cold water, it will feel warm. So, which hands of yours should you believe? Fair enough. And others like that. But what he's trying to say with the Eleatics, with Parmenides as well, that we should somehow raise ourselves above seeing this world of shadows, which he calls it, and see that everything in this world, is in fact just a poor and imperfect copy of something really perfect. Those forms, eidos in Greek, or idea means to see as well. Something you see, but not with your physical eyes, but with your mind's eye. Those are the eternal forms. Like, for example, I call this, and everyone call this a table, yet of course it is a table, but not the table itself, or as sometimes Plato would say, the tableness, the idea of the table, which is in fact a perfect form, which is put into practice when it meets, and it is put in, put together and with matter comes. So the idea takes shape in matter. Of course, it will be called the table. It will be called the table. So the name of the idea would be the name of the product as well. Although we all know that it is not the table itself, it's just a table, and therefore, as a copy, it participates or takes part of the idea of the table, but it's not the table itself. Or, for example, you could say that Sir Lancelot was the brave. Okay. Sir Lancelot really, in the court of King Arthur, was indeed brave, but he was not bravery himself. He took a part. He was partaking in the bravery, in the idea of bravery. It's like think of it like that, like asking for a cup of coffee or a cup of tea in English. I would like to have a cup of tea. This "of" means in fact that, well, there's this notion of tea. It's a massive, big bowl, whatever, an infinite, the huge bowl of tea, cup, out of which you can have a cup of tea. So you don't have the whole of the tea, no, just a cup of. That's the same thing, this is how I could liken it to Plato's thinking. So that means, of course, if something is beautiful, like let's say the statue of Aphrodite is beautiful, true, but that statue of Aphrodite is not beauty itself, yet it is a particular beauty, etc., etc., etc. So, it basically means that a lot of virtually everything existing on this earth, or what we see, has almost virtually a perfect original, as it were, in this world of forms, including notions, including the idea of good, the idea of just, the idea of beauty, the idea of bravery, etc. So including virtues, including geometric forms, etc. So this adds to the notion, or leads to the notion that, in fact, in Plato's world, there is obviously, in the world of ideas, there is definitely the ideal Pasztori-Kupan who is in fact the perfect. It's not a Pasztori-Kupan, it is the one, the perfect one, who could explain all this to you perfectly. But unfortunately, in this earthly life, in this earthly world of shadows, you'd have to put up with this very, very poor copy, believe me. It's really poor, that's it. So, the idea, of course, is that the partaking in the idea is what makes this whole thing quite exciting. Now, in the book of the Republic, which we will discuss probably also during next class, concerning the virtues, etc., in Plato's world, he has in fact 3 different examples to present the world of ideas. One is in fact the example or the comparison of the sun. The other one is the comparison of the line, or divided line. You can actually look it up yourselves back home. The third one, which is a more elaborate example, is what we are dealing with here in the coming minutes. And it is to be found at the very beginning of book 7 of Plato's Republic. And it is normally called, or it's usually called, the allegory of the cave. Some people would argue it's not simply an allegory of the cave, it is almost an experiment of the cave. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Let's try and analyze this. So, as I said, what I will do is I will read the text. You will see the image, and we will try to make sense of what is going on. So it is a discussion between Socrates, the teacher, obviously, and Glaucon, the student. You know that the dialogue, the Platonic dialogues, are always they always take 2 people, and they are not equal in rank, as it were. There's the teacher who is asking the questions, who is then, of course, leading the discussion. And there's the student or disciple who answers, who may agree or may disagree with the teacher. If he disagrees with the teacher, then the teacher has to ask further questions in order to persuade him or to find a different way of argumentation. But the student does not present his own position in an elaborate way. For example, in Plato's Academy, these discussions, these dialogues were actually taking place all the time. Sometimes even that 2 students were actually discussing something, and one was playing the role of the teacher, the other one of the disciple. Once they ended the discussion, they changed roles, and they perhaps could have discussed the very same theme all over again. It would actually be very good if our common speakers and politicians and whatever would at least end up doing that in order to respect the certain stages of you state first what you want to prove. Second, you would have to find a common nominator, a statement that both of you agree, before you start debating, as well as you'd have to know what they think, to state what do you think the other one is talking about. Mostly 99% of the cases, this never happens. That is why sometimes, you just have two monologues on television between two politicians or whatever. They just never intersect, or they just never meet each other because they absolutely do not know the basic rules of the dialogue, although it's set in, well, not in stone, but it's written down in Plato, very, very well documented. Okay, but that's a different story. So there's Socrates and Glaucon, Book 7, The Republic. Socrates speaks. And now, I said, let me show in a figure how far our nature is enlightened or unenlightened. Behold, or imagine, human beings living in an underground den, in an underground cave. Here they have been from their childhood and have their legs and necks chained. Okay. So that they cannot move and can only see before them, so they can only look ahead. Being prevented by the chains from turning around their heads. Above and behind them, there is a fire. It is blazing at a distance, and between the fire and the prisoner there is a raised way. And you will see, if you look, that there is a low wall built along the way, like the screen which marionette players have in front of them, over which they show the puppets. Puppet show. I see. And do you see men passing along the wall, carrying all sorts of vessels and statues and figures of animals and made of wood and stone and various materials which appear over the wall. Some of them are talking, some of them are silent. Okay, Glaucon says, you have shown me a very strange image, and they are very strange prisoners indeed. Okay, to which Socrates replies, well, these prisoners are in fact us. I'm talking about ourselves. And they see only their own shadows, or the shadows of one another, which the fire throws on the opposite wall of the cave. That's all they see. Because they can only look forward. Have any of you have seen The Matrix?
Yes.
Okay. This is The Matrix.
Yes.
It is The Matrix.
Yes.
It is The Matrix. And it's just beginning. It is just beginning. Yeah. So that you see the shadows. Well, it's us sitting in front of the television, sitting in front of the computer screen, browsing the internet, looking at our mobile phones. It's not the reality, it's a virtual reality. It's what is presented to you. I don't want to, instill fear in you. I'm just trying to, it's a philosophical thing, but it's a very, very interesting thing. So, how could they see, says Glaucon, true, he says, this is true. How could they see anything but the shadows if they were never allowed to move their heads? That's it, that's just what they see. And he says, and of the objects which are being carried in like manner, they would only see the shadows, of course, nothing else. And if they were able to converse with one another, would they not suppose that they were naming what was actually before them? That they would think that this is the reality? Well, very true. And suppose further that the prison had an echo which came from the other side. Would they not be sure to fancy, when one of the passers-by spoke, that the voice which they heard came from the passing shadow? That is certain. No question. So that if someone is carrying this horse, and speaking, and the horse is passing by, they would just think, well, it's the horse that speaks, doesn't it? So to them, I said, the truth would be literally nothing but the shadows of the images, nothing else. That would be the truth for them. Certainly. And now look again. And see what will naturally follow if the prisoners were released and disabused of their error. At first, when any of them, let's take one, any of them is liberated and suddenly compelled to stand up and turn his neck around and walk and look towards the light, he will suffer sharp pains. The glare will distress him, and he will be unable to see the realities of which in his former state he had seen the shadows. And then imagine someone saying to him that what he saw before on the wall was just an illusion. But that now, when he's approaching nearer to being, and his eye is turned towards more real existence, like the fire and the people around him, he has a clearer vision. Now, what will be his reply? And you may further imagine that his instructor is pointing to the objects themselves as they pass in front of the light, and requires him to name them. Tell me what that is. Will he not be perplexed? Will he not be confused? Will he not fancy that the shadows which he formerly saw are truer than the objects which are now shown to him? So, far truer. So that he would still think, no, this can't be. This is the reality. This is what I said. This is something. It can't be. Far truer. And let's say if he were to be compelled to look straight at the light, the fire, will he not have a pain in his eyes which will make him turn away, to take in the objects of vision which he can see, so to see other objects, and which he will conceive to be in reality clearer than the things which are now being shown to him? True. Now, suppose once more that this man of ours, who's been freed, is not stopping here, but he's literally, he says, he's reluctantly dragged up. Somebody's dragging him up here on the steep and rugged ascent and held fast until he is forced outside of the cave into the presence of the sun itself. Is he not likely to be pained and irritated? He will feel pain. He will be irritated. When he approaches the light, his eyes will be dazzled, and he will not be able to see anything at all of what are now called realities. Not all in a moment, the student replies, Glaucon. Now, he will require to grow accustomed to the sight of the upper world. It takes time. And first, he will see the shadows best. Next, the reflection of men and other objects in the water. And then the objects themselves. Then he will gaze upon the light of the moon and of the stars and the spangled heaven. And he will see the sky and the stars by night better than the sun or the light of the sun by day. Isn't it true? Certainly. So then, last of all, he will be able to see the sun, and not mere reflections of the sun in the water, but he will see the sun in its proper own place and not in another. And he will contemplate him as he is, meaning the throne. Certainly. He will then proceed to argue that this is he who gives the season and the years, the sun, and is the guardian of all that is visible in the world, or that is in the visible world. And in a certain way, he would argue that the sun must be the cause of all things, which he and his fellows have been accustomed to behold down in the cave. Well, Glaucon replies, clearly, he would see first the sun and then reason about the sun. Now, and when he remembered his old habitation, comes back to remember his old habitation, and the wisdom of the den and his fellow prisoners, do you not suppose that he would felicitate himself on the change and pity them who are still there? Certainly he would. And if they were, let's say, in the habit down in the den, if conferring honors, giving titles and giving gifts and, diplomas among themselves to those who were the quickest to observe the passing shadows and to remark which of these shadows went before and which followed after and which were together, and who were therefore best able to draw conclusions as to the future. Do you think that which shadow will follow, etc.? Do you think that he would care for such honors and glories, or envy their possessors? Would he not say with Homer, and here's the quotation from the 11th book of Odyssey, I would better be a poor servant of a poor master and endure anything, rather than think as they do and live after their manner. It's actually a quotation, first part is a quotation from the Odyssey. It's actually the moment when Odysseus looks into the shadow, into the world, into the underworld, and praises Achilles. Don't worry about death, because we are still respecting you. Says, well, I'd rather plow the earth for the poorest. I would rather be the slave of a slave, just to be on the face of the earth rather than in the shadows. So it's the same effect. He would rather be the poorest man, outside there, rather than to sit there and be honored with all these diplomas and everything for guessing which shadow comes first and which will follow, etc., being a prophet downstairs. Yes, he said, Glaucon, I think that he would rather suffer anything than entertain these false notions and live in this miserable manner once he has, of course, experienced the reality. Imagine once more, continues Socrates, such a one coming suddenly out of the sun. Now, imagine him now coming out of the sun and being placed back into his old situation. Would he not be certain to have his eyes full of darkness? To be sure, he said. Now, and if there were a contest, and he had to compete in measuring the shadows with the prisoners, who had never moved out of the den, while his sight was still weak, because it comes from the light, and before his eyes had become steady, and the time which would be needed to acquire this new habit of sight might be very considerable, might be long, would he not be ridiculous? Men would say of him that up he went and down he came without his eyes, so and that it was better not to not even think to climb up to ascend. It's not worth it. And if anyone tried to loose another of his prisoners and lead him up to the light, let them only catch the offender and they would put him to death. No question, he said. They would definitely. So this entire allegory, this is the whole point of the allegory. This entire allegory, I said, you may now append, dear Glaucon, to the previous argument. Because, and what he's now doing is actually saying, well, as he said at the beginning, this is in fact us. sitting in the den, in this world. He says, the prison house, this prison house, the den, is in fact the world of sight. Sorry. Okay, so the prison house is the world of sight, the world what we see. The light of the fire is the sun. So remember, this is our world. This is the comparison. Not this. This is our world, he says. So the light of the sun is the fire. And you will not misunderstand me if you interpret the journey upwards to be the ascent, the climbing of the soul into the intellectual world, according to my poor belief, which, at your desire, I have expressed, whether rightly or wrongly, God knows. But whether true or false, my opinion is that in the world of knowledge, the idea of good, this is where we are at, this is the most important notion in Socrates' philosophy, the idea of good, so that, in my opinion, in the world of knowledge, the idea of good appears last of all, and is seen only with an effort. And when seen, it is also inferred to be the universal author of all things beautiful and right. It is the parent of light and of the Lord of light in this visible world, and the immediate source of reason and truth in the intellectual. And that this is the power upon which he who would act rationally, either in public or in private life, must have his eye fixed. So this is the notion of good is the most important thing. I agree, he said, as far as I'm able to understand you. Now you must wonder, moreover, that those who attain this beatific, this great vision, are unwilling to descend to human affairs. They just, how shall I put it? They can't be bothered anymore. For their souls are ever hastening into the upper world, where they desire to dwell. This is where they long to be. Which desire of theirs is very natural, if our allegory may be trusted. Of course, they have experienced something, that changes everything. I don't have to. How should I put it? Refer back to the Matrix again. But you see, the traitor in the Matrix is again someone who actually very much that chap is actually very much one of those who left it and said, no, it's not worth climbing up. No, just let us go back to our world of illusions, to the world of shadows. This is where, how should I put it? It's like you know that something is going on, or something that is not entirely good. But if you know that, let's say, something is not right, reasonably, to some extent bad, but there is a security in something that you know what's wrong with it, or you assume to know what's wrong with it. It's better than actually climbing up and clinging from something that you don't know. The unknown appears to us far more dangerous than even the bad things that we assume that we do know. Okay, so and is there anything surprising, continues Socrates, is there anything surprising in one who passes from divine contemplations to the evil state of man, misbehaving himself in a ridiculous manner, if, while his eyes are blinking and before he has become accustomed to the surrounding darkness, he is compelled to fight in courts of law? Remember, this is written after the death of Socrates, of course, so he is compelled to fight in courts of law. Or in other places, about the images or the shadows of images of justice. Not about justice, about the shadows of the images of justice. See? And is endeavoring to meet the conceptions of those who have never yet seen absolute justice. So that you have seen the idea of good, you have seen the idea of justice with your mind's eye. And now you are back in a court, in the den, you know, whereas you're arguing about the shadows of justice. And who's right. Nobody cares about what is truth. Everybody's concerned with who's right, you know, in this world of shadows. Anyone who has common sense will remember that the bewilderments of the eyes, so the problem of, you know, this problem to see with your eyes, are of two kinds and arise from two different causes. Either from coming out of the light or from going into the light, which is true of the mind's eye as well, quite as much as of the bodily eye. And he who remembers this, when he sees anyone whose vision is perplexed and weak, will not be too ready to laugh. He will first ask whether that soul of man has come out of the brighter light and is unable to see because it is unaccustomed to the dark. Or, having turned from darkness to the day, is dazzled by the excessive light. And he will count one happy in his condition and state of being, and he will pity the other, because it depends on whether you come from the light into the darkness or from the darkness into the light. Or if he have a mind to laugh at the soul, which comes from below into the light, there will be more reason in this man in the laugh, which greets him who returns from above out of the light into the den. That is, he says, Plato says, is a very just distinction. But then, if I am right, certain professors of education must be wrong when they say that they can put a knowledge into the soul which was not there before, like sight into blind eyes. They undoubtedly say this, he replied. Whereas our argument shows that the power and capacity of learning exists in the soul already, and that just as the eye was unable to turn from darkness to light without the whole body being turned, so too the instrument of knowledge can only be the movement of the whole soul to be turned from the world of becoming onto the world of being, and learn by degrees to endure the sight of being and of the brightest and best of being, or in other words, or the good of the good. What is going on about now? It's actually the second thing after the world of ideas, the second notion, which we will touch upon a bit. It's the so-called theory of remembering, or theory of anamnesis by Plato. The Greek word anamnesis, anamnesko means to remember. You probably, there is also a Greek word that actually has filtered into the English, the word amnesia. You know what amnesia is? When you lost your memory, you don't remember something. Now this anamnesia means actually to remember. Amnesia means to forget. Anamnesia is to bring something back into your mind again. What is the point? In many of his works, Plato, I should argue, early works, it appears to have come from Socrates, and we shall return to the text for the last bit. But I just wanted to explain this to you first. It's actually that the process of learning is in fact not what we assume to be, that the mind actually acquires new information via reading, via teaching, etc. No. The process of learning, according to this educational philosophy of Plato, if you want to put it that way, is in fact remembering. The theory is the following. All of us, all our souls, before having descended into our present bodies, as it were, have been, well, together with the ideas in this perfect world of perfect realities. We saw everything in its perfect ideal form. We saw not a table, but the table or tableness itself. We didn't see human justice or earthly justice. We saw the justice itself. We didn't see some nice gestures or good deeds, but the idea of good or goodness itself, etc., etc. But once we came to this world, once we came to be born in this existence, the soul, as you know, he puts it metaphorically, the soul drank of the water of the river of forgetfulness. Lethe would be the name of the river. So it forgot everything that the soul, she in fact, in English, she forgot everything that she knew before. So the way of doing things, that's why Socrates always asks the questions and the disciple replies, because in fact, teaching is nothing else but helping you remember. So basically, I haven't taught you anything today, and I never ever teach you anything. I just help you remember. Yeah. Wouldn't it be nice to remember everything just with the buttons and just by pressing a button? So that's the idea of anamnesis, so remembering. So there's nothing I can tell you that you don't already know. What I'm trying to do is help you remember. Remember Socrates being born of a midwife. His mother was a midwife. So he always called himself as being a philosopher midwife, meaning that his role was, as he himself admitted, to actually help the good thoughts being born into this world in people's minds. So help the good thoughts to come into this world like babies, as his mother did as midwife, helping babies come to this world. He's trying to help good thoughts in people being born and being materialized. Now, and this is where the discussion continues a bit, and we will wrap it up soon. Socrates continues, and must there not be some art which will effect conversion in the easiest and quickest manner, not implanting the faculty of sight, for that exists already. So I don't have to teach you how to see, because you have the faculty of sight, but has been turned in the wrong direction and is looking away from the truth. So it's in fact, it's not that they cannot see, they're just looking in the wrong direction. See my point? So each of them is capable to see these realities, to see the fire, and to come up and see around. It's a different thing whether you can actually convince them to turn their heads, to turn their eyes onto something else, to actually turn away from... You see my point? So then, yes, he said, such an art may be presumed. And whereas, it's about taking the blue or the red pill, for that matter, isn't it? Can you convince the guy to take the proper pill? Or is it the proper pill for him or her? Etc., etc. Yeah. And whereas the other so-called virtues of the soul seem to be akin, or like to bodily qualities, for even when they are not originally innate, they can be implanted later by habit and exercise. This is a very interesting thing, that he is a believer in the effectiveness of actually education. It's an important point. So that they can be implanted by habit and exercise. The wisdom more than anything else contains a divine element, wisdom, which always remains, and by this conversion is rendered useful and profitable, or on the other hand, hurtful and useless. Did you never observe the narrow intelligence flashing from the keen eye of a clever rogue? How eager he is, how clearly his paltry soul sees the way to his end. He is the reverse of blind, but his keen eyesight is forced into the service of evil, and he is mischievous in proportion to his cleverness. Very interesting how actually someone who's clever yet chooses the darkness. It does not, because he doesn't want, he or she doesn't want to see the light, and not just the truth, the good, because actually the absolute idea, as is obvious, is the idea of good. And it's not that simple. The major Socratic question always is, define what is good. That's the point. Okay, and the last bit. But what if there had been a circumcision of such natures in the days of their youth, and they had been severed from once so those sensual pleasures, such as eating and drinking, which like leaden weights were attached to them at their birth, and which dragged them down and turned the vision of their souls upon the things that are below? If, I say, they had been released from these impediments and turned in the opposite direction, the very same faculty in them would have seen the truth as keenly as they see what their eyes are turned to now. And of course, it goes on with the notion of how to educate the young, to actually not be trapped in this den, morally, psychologically, and in any other sense you can think of. Of course, and this is where, in fact, his notion of how to educate the young, etc., comes into play. For example, that not to teach them, bad things about the gods, etc., etc. But that comes on at a different stage. So we're wrapping up this at the end of our of today's lecture by saying that the allegory of the cave, or I would say sometimes even the experiment of the cave, is something that is shockingly real in various sense. It's almost sort of a timeless kind of thing of actually the world of shadows being in fact all or any distraction that actually sometimes leads us away from the path of good morality, etc., etc. As we said, and it's very obvious in Socrates' case, he doesn't really deal with how this world came about, what are the main elements, etc. It's all left behind. It's us here. What is our job? And what is our moral duty? What is the, categoricus imperativus, if you want, it will come millennia later, the notion, but the point is already here in these sentences. So next week we shall discuss about Plato's Republic and how the society in Plato's Republic is structured, and related to that, to what extent are people within this society seen as living in a just and good society? What are the main virtues, and how you actually exercise them in becoming virtuous people? And education, in that sense, plays a major part in that. Thank you very much for your attention.